Hello everybody, welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, psychology, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with one another. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. There are multiple definitions of the left-right political spectrum which exist and have existed. Multiple conceptions of what it means to be on the right side of the spectrum and what it means to be on the left side of the spectrum. And the criteria for what makes a person, group, or position left-wing or right-wing has varied throughout history. However, one core feature, which could arguably be called a defining or the defining feature, of determining what side of the spectrum a particular person or viewpoint lies is their view toward change. Now you may be asking, well, what kind of change is it that you speak of? What is it that we are changing from, and what are we changing into? Well, the change that we are referring to is changing from the starting point of hierarchy and order, which represent the right side of the spectrum, toward greater freedom and equality, representing the left side of the spectrum. So for the sake of this discussion, we will discuss various different stages on this spectrum, which take into account particular positions with regard to the pursuit of change in the direction of further freedom and equality. Those stages are moving from right to left, conservative, liberal, progressive, and revolutionary. Now I should preface this by adding the disclaimer that this is by no means an exhaustive, end-all be-all way of discussing the stages on the spectrum, rather an attempt at a generally efficient and succinct way of defining and categorizing how individuals, groups, and ideologies may view and move toward the change we discussed. One may very well choose whatever name they like to describe these positions on the spectrum. The objective was merely to attempt to use the labels which most commonly and most accurately apply to each stage on the spectrum and their views with regard to the speed of change we discussed. So in defining and examining each stage, we will begin our discussion at the time of the French Revolution, where the concept of left-wing versus right-wing politics would originate. The French Revolution was a period of drastic social and political upheaval, which witnessed a revolt against traditional French institutions such as absolute monarchy, aristocracy, domination by the church, and the feudal system, amongst others. During the French Revolution, members of the French National Assembly were divided into those who supported the king, who were seated to his right, and those who supported the revolution, and therefore opposed monarchy, who were seated to his left. But now that we've discussed where the concept of left versus right originated, we need to go back a little further and discuss the origin of the term liberal and the corresponding ideology of liberalism. Liberalism originated prior to the French Revolution in the 17th century. The English philosopher Jean-Jacques is generally considered to be the father of liberalism, and his political philosophy advocated for religious tolerance and political freedom consisting of limited government, whereby rulers were to refrain from infringing upon the individual's right to life, liberty, and property. The American Revolution would be heavily influenced by these ideas. Support for institutions and ideas such as representative democracy, separation of church and state, freedom of speech, and a free market economy would become defining features of liberalism, and based upon this definition, a liberal would have initially been an individual who supported these institutions and ideas. The American Revolution would soon be followed by another revolution founded upon the ideals of liberalism, and that would be the French Revolution. The French Revolution would be largely based upon the ideas of the philosophers Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both of whom would be influenced by John Locke. Rousseau would go even further than Locke in his calls for freedom and would place emphasis on social equality, critiquing the social inequality of his time, stating that humanity was freer and more equal before the advent of government, referring to humanity before government as noble savages. So this brings us back to our starting point with the origin of the left-right spectrum. We had the French National Assembly with two different groups on each side of the king. On the right side, we had those who supported the king, and therefore absolute monarchy, aristocracy, feudalism, the marriage of church and state, in sum, the established order and traditions of that time based upon social hierarchy. On the left, we had those who opposed the king and supported the revolution, and therefore representative democracy, secular government, in sum, undoing the established social order in favor of bringing about greater social equality and freedom. This was embodied by their slogan, freedom, equality, fraternity. As the years passed following the start of the revolution, this left-right dichotomy would expand to resemble more of a spectrum, including a center and parties on the left and right to varying degrees. Now this brings us to the origins of the idea of liberal versus conservative in the English-speaking world. The two camps can generally be said to have their origins in the ideas of Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. Edmund Burke was an Anglo-Irish philosopher and member of Parliament from the 18th century. He believed that societal change is something which happens gradually and organically, and that attempts at social change need to take into consideration the traditions of that given society. He had supported the American Revolution, but had opposed the French Revolution. Burke believed that the American Revolution was in line with the values and traditions of its society, as taxation without representation would violate social norms. However, he believed that the French Revolution was a rebuke of that society's traditions, and he was therefore highly critical of it. Thomas Paine had supported the American Revolution, writing the famous pamphlet in favor of it entitled Common Sense, and he would go on to support the French Revolution as well. Similar to the views held by Rousseau, he believed that government was the cause of society's problems, and in line with this, Paine believed that the remedy for this was the complete overturning of the established social order through revolution. Burke is considered to be the father of modern conservatism, and Paine considered the father of the liberal tradition of the English-speaking world. Now this brings us to the branches of the left-right spectrum which we discussed at the beginning of this video. A conservative can be defined as someone who wishes to preserve the current social order and traditions of a given society. In the post-American revolutionary world, a conservative would be those who wish to preserve the institutions produced by it, such as representative democracy, freedom of religion, as well as support of a market economy, yet who oppose the further egalitarianism of the French Revolution for what they viewed as its attempts to completely erase and replace the existing social order and traditions. Those who would call for further change in the direction of freedom and equality would be labeled as social liberals or simply as liberals in the United States. So bringing us back to the left-right spectrum, as opposed to a conservative who wishes to preserve the current social order and status quo, a liberal may be defined as someone who wishes to bring about social change in the direction of increased freedom and equality. Now, of course, this is an extremely broad definition, and it should be noted that the conservatives who wish to preserve the political system produced by the American Revolution could also technically be labeled as liberals in the broader theoretical sense, as they would subscribe to the general political philosophy of liberalism, which, as we discussed, the American Revolution was founded upon. In the years to come, we would witness a rise in the spread of the ideas and institutions of liberalism, such as democracy, separation of church and state, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the end of feudalism and mercantilism, the abolition of slavery, resulting in what is generally viewed as progress in the direction of greater freedom and equality. This leads us to our next stage on the left-right spectrum. Progressives, broadly speaking, are those who believe in perpetual social reform in the direction of increased freedom and equality. Unlike conservatives, who wish to preserve the current status quo and traditions and believe change should happen gradually and organically, progressives advocate for continual progress to eliminate social inequality, yet generally stop short of advocating for all-out revolution to bring about this change. This may also distinguish them from those who are labeled simply as liberals, as it can be argued that liberals support change in the direction of freedom and equality, but do not necessarily support it continuing to progress in this manner in a linear fashion. However, the terms liberal and progressive have often been used interchangeably throughout history. This now brings us back to our history lesson. Following the French Revolution, revolutions would spread all across Europe, reaching their peak in 1848. We would see the likes of Karl Marx predict widespread revolution by the working class or proletariat, which would result in a society free of class, with workers controlling the means of production. This would lead to the rise of communist thinkers and activists who sought drastic, sudden change brought about by means of revolution, which would bring further equality and freedom to society, culminating in the egalitarian society championed by Marx. This would bring us to the furthest left on the spectrum, which represents those who may be labeled as revolutionaries. Unlike conservatives, who wish to preserve the current social order, liberals who wish to change it, and progressives who wish to continually reform society to become more free and equal, and may therefore be referred to as reformists, revolutionaries seek drastic, sudden change brought about directly by the masses in an egalitarian manner, resulting in a massive overhaul of society's norms, institutions, and/or traditions, resulting in a dramatically more free and equal society. Movements and individuals subscribing to ideologies such as anarchism, socialism, and particularly Marxism and communism have been labeled as revolutionary and may have referred to themselves by that same label and have brought about actual revolution, such as the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which established the Soviet Union, and the Communist Revolution in China, which brought the current People's Republic of China into power. Now, it should be noted that while in the post-French revolutionary world, those who primarily have been ascribed the label of revolutionary, often by self-designation, have been Marxists, socialists, and/or communists, those who supported the American Revolution at its time and were labeled as revolutionaries, despite it being the case that those who would carry on the values and institutions brought about by that revolution would be considered or would consider themselves conservatives or liberals. And additionally, those who supported the French Revolution at its time clearly fit the label of revolutionaries, and in fact inspired the revolutionary stance of Marxist revolutionaries, despite those who would carry on the institutions and ideas brought about by that revolution, generally falling into the category of liberals or progressives. Now, it may seem that we have reached the end of our discussion of the left-right spectrum. However, there is one more stage on this spectrum which we have not yet discussed. So again, to recap, a conservative wishes to preserve the status quo, a liberal seeks change to increase freedom and equality, a progressive seeks continual change and progress to bring about greater freedom and equality, and a revolutionary seeks sudden, drastic change brought about directly by the masses, creating a drastically freer and more equal society. Based upon our definition, it may seem that those to the furthest right on the spectrum are conservatives. However, there are those who go further to the right on the spectrum, and those are reactionaries. Reactionaries are those who do not merely wish to preserve the current status quo, but go further and wish to return society to a previous status quo from the past. Following the revolutions of 1848, while those on the far ends of the left would call for further revolutions until an egalitarian, classless society could be achieved, many on the right would call for society to return to the way things were before the revolutions and reject many of the institutions and ideas which would arise, such as representative democracy, separation of church and state, capitalism, socialism, communism, etc. Many wished for a return to the societal traditions and institutions of the Middle Ages, such as monarchy, aristocracy, commingling of the church and state, and an agrarian society. In other words, it could be said that these individuals supported the position of those who sat on the right side during the French Revolution, however still held this position after the changes produced by the French and subsequent revolutions had already been enacted. If the left end of the spectrum represents those who wish to move toward greater freedom and equality, to varying degrees and at varying rates, reactionaries, often referred to as the far right, seek a return to hierarchy and order, often standing in opposition to egalitarianism. Reactionaries have often held the view that society is in decline or degeneration, and the cure to society's ills is a return to past glory, seeking a sort of cultural revival. Far-right movements often look back nostalgically on what they consider to be their nation's glorious pasts, which they view to be superior to the current degenerated state of society. The reactionary far-right's opposition to egalitarianism and preference for hierarchy can manifest itself in various forms such as acceptance of and desire for clearly defined and solidified classes within society, and/or ethnic or racial hierarchies, as was the case with Nazism and other ultranationalist movements. And it should be noted that while reactionaries wish to return society to a past status quo, that return to the past may represent a drastic social change, and in that sense, reactionaries may simultaneously be labeled as revolutionaries. However, not in the same manner as the far-left revolutionaries we previously discussed, due to the opposition of those on the far right to the egalitarianism of the far left. 20th century movements, commonly labeled as reactionary, sought to advance the pre-modern ideals and norms of hierarchy and order within the framework and with the tools of the modern world. For example, Benito Mussolini had referred to Italian fascism as both reactionary and revolutionary, highlighting that he did not wish to return to the absolute monarchy and domination by the Catholic Church of the past, but wished to advance his illiberal, hierarchical values in new ways. Additionally, the Nazis opposed certain traditional German movements and institutions such as monarchists, the nobility, and the Catholic Church, and referred to their rise to power as a national revolution, all the while advancing their anti-egalitarian agenda of racial hierarchy. In order to distinguish between the egalitarian perspective of revolutionaries on the far left of the spectrum, it may be useful to refer to both ends of the spectrum as radical, with those on the far left of the spectrum being referred to as revolutionaries or the radical left, and those on the far right as reactionaries or the radical right. It should be noted that with regard to all branches on this left-right spectrum, the way in which a given position manifests itself depends on the time, values, and status quo of a given society. The monarchists sitting on the left side during the French Revolution would have been conservatives, as they wished to preserve the current status quo of monarchy and aristocracy. However, once democracy, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, etc., had become widespread, those in favor of monarchy and aristocracy would have been reactionaries as opposed to conservatives, as they wished to return society to a previous socio-political system. And in fact, those referred to as reactionaries often do not use that label to refer to themselves, preferring to refer to themselves as conservatives. Conversely, as we discussed, those who had supported the liberalism of the American Revolution, limited government, political freedom, separation of church and state, and the replacement of feudalism with capitalism, who could be referred to as liberals, as they were supporters of the political philosophy of liberalism, had become conservatives by the time of Edmund Burke, with their opposition to calls for further freedom and equality seen within the French Revolution. Those who supported the American and French Revolution, as Thomas Paine did, were now the liberals. For this reason, the liberalism, which supports limited government and a free market system with minimal government intervention, is often referred to as classical liberalism, distinguishing it from the liberalism of those who sit further to the left on the spectrum. Additionally, as we mentioned, while those who supported the French Revolution after it had already taken place would have been liberals and/or progressives in their desire to see continued progress toward freedom and equality, those who actually waged the French Revolution logically would have been categorized as revolutionaries as opposed to liberals or progressives, as they attempted to bring about immediate social change brought about directly by the masses. Further, in post-revolutionary Marxist societies, such as the Soviet Union or Communist China, particularly under Mao, where the political social systems were founded by those furthest to the left of the spectrum, would anyone to the right, such as classical liberals or even progressives, be considered reactionaries? There may be some merit to this view, as post-revolutionary Marxist societies referred to those who rebelled against that political system as counter-revolutionaries. Furthermore, could those left-wing former revolutionaries now be considered conservatives, as they wish to preserve the post-revolutionary status quo? What if someone or some group takes a conservative position on one issue, such as a particular social or cultural issue, yet takes a progressive position on another issue, such as a certain economic issue? How would you categorize the view of that individual or group? Or is the left-right spectrum outdated and an overall flawed tool for judging the political views and objectives of individuals and social movements? Let me know what you think in the comment section. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to you next time. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video.